Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hey everybody, welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. We have a brand new year and a brand new season. 2021 is upon us, and I want to wish you a happy new year. So excited about the episodes that are coming up. We have a lot of great conversations. Today is with Dr. Todd Bowman. We're talking about alcohol. We jump into what's up with morality, psychology, the brain in the context of alcohol. Today, there is a lot of margin in the way people think about alcohol. Some find it as a sin, others find it to be something based in moderation, and others feel like that anything that makes you feel good in the moment, out of all the problems on the planet, what's the big deal with getting drunk? And so we talk about that not only as Christians, but as pastors, ministers, leaders. We jump into things like family systems. We even get into pastor psychological profiles and what predisposes them. We look at what driven leaders are driven by. We jump into things around pastors' weekly rhythms and the stress management mechanisms in their lives. We look at various sides of people's lives who have stepped across certain lines, guardrails, and ended up losing so much. It's just an amazing conversation, and I'm glad you're here to be a part of it. It's part one of a two-part series on alcohol, and I encourage you to tighten your seatbelt and let's get ready to rock and roll. Let's go now with Dr. Todd Bowman. Welcome everybody to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm so excited today to have Dr. Todd Bowman with us. And for those of you that don't know who he is a psychologist and behavioral scientist. He is the Associate Professor of Counseling at Indiana Wesleyan University. He's an Adjunct Professor for Human Sexuality at Nazarene Theological Seminary, an Adjunct Professor of the Intro to Psychology at Nazarene Bible College. He's an author and editor of Reclaiming Sexual Wholeness. And of pastoral interest, he has administered decks of psychological assessments for seminary candidates. And I think the most profound part of his resume is that he's a fellow of the Red Ink Revival leadership team, facilitating a lot of our Red Ink experiences. Todd's married to Rebecca for 17 years and has 3 kids. And man, he is my buddy. He's my friend, and I'm glad that we get to do this again.
Absolutely, man. I've been looking so forward to this, getting back in the saddle, and here we are. It's been a weird year. And
Yes. And 2021, we have an opportunity to redirect, focus, and to make a difference. Well, today we want to talk about alcohol, alcoholism, alcohol use disorder, which is the DSM-5 title, alcohol dependence. Let's begin by simply asking the question, how can we define what alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, what's it all about? How do we define it?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to be thinking about those two as related, but fundamentally separate, right? Like they're distinct dynamics. Alcoholism is more of our colloquial term. It's kind of a way to think about really family systems at large. So when we think about alcoholism or an alcoholic, we're talking about the presence of a substance use disorder, in this instance, alcohol use disorder. But really with alcoholism, we're talking about the behavioral, the psychological, the systemic ramifications of that rather than just more of the behavioral indicators, which the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illness, that alcohol use disorder language really is kind of a dimensional model looking at how severe the use is, but it's all behavioral indicators. And when we think about alcoholism, we really have to be thinking a bit more broadly to pan out a little bit and to capture the totality of the impact of that set of behaviors that we're seeing diagnostically.
Well, there's a couple things you said that I want to dig down on first, just to get clarity. First, you mentioned it's a family systems issue. What do you mean when you say family systems? What is a family system?
Sure. So kind of generically thinking, a family system, different levels, right? You've kind of got your family of origin, which would be your parents and your siblings, if you have siblings. Then you have extended family system, which would be the conglomerate of aunts and uncles and grandparents on both sides, and right, which is obviously much larger. All of those experiences, kind of living in that milieu of family norms and customs and spirituality and emotional health or emotional and wellness, all of that is shaping how our minds and our bodies develop spiritually, how we grow and mature. So it's kind of a social construct in many ways. So we're looking at every family has a system, or every family is a system, and every system has norms.
Yeah.
And really kind of what we look at as we grow in age is how do we inhabit those norms?
Yeah.
And how do we either carry out those norms and perpetuate them, or do we react against and cultivate a new set of norms for our own families as we kind of leave and cleave and launch and partner and build families and have kids and do all that.
So there are things in a family system that are spoken rules, and then there are those things that are unspoken rules.
Absolutely.
In other words, there are things that just this family and the way we interact, and again, grandparents to aunts, uncles, to siblings, to parents, all of this swirls, and we never slow down generally to actually look and identify what are these rules. In some families, it's we don't talk. If there is any elephant in the room, you just act like it's not there until you don't even notice it anymore. And so when you think of these rules, what are some more of the rules? Because what I want to do is set up a framework for as we walk through alcoholism, and the destructive behaviors that actually steal trust and demoralize so much of the dream we have for our families. So talk to us a little bit more. What are some other kind of spoken and unspoken rules that family systems have that maybe our listeners are going to be able to identify with?
Yeah. Well, if I can take that and then maybe up the ante a little bit, Patrick. You know, what we see more and more today is blended systems where you've already got a blending of systems when a husband and wife come together and marry, and the holidays are a great time for kind of getting our finger on the pulse of that.
Yeah.
Kind of, if you're a young married person, you are in that process of, well, our family has these traditions and does this. Well, we do this, and what are we going to do? What are we going to carry forward? Yeah. Who's that going to offend? Right. So there's always a blending in coupleship. Well, in blended systems, right? Like if you're divorced and remarried, right? Like now you've blended once, you've kind of created a subsystem or a very unique family culture, and then you're thinking about having to open that back up and integrate new people into it. So to your point, it never slows down. It's perpetually complex, is what I'd like to say about it. That even in family systems that are intact, there's ongoing evolution as kids age, as they start bringing, in my instance, I've got 3 boys, right? Like when they start marrying, right? Like that's going to change a lot. We've never had young ladies in our house. Like what kind of privacy do they need that's different than what our boys, our teenage now boys live with? All right, so it's always in evolution. That's the beauty of it, that some of these norms, if they get off when you're young, right, like they can be corrected. So family systems are living things, and there's a lot of hope of redemption in that narrative. I mean, we even think of some of the biblical family systems, right, where there's dysfunction, and then there's redemption in the process of those families as they mature. So some of these norms, I think, really conflict, how we navigate conflict. You mentioned about, if there's an elephant in the room, are we just going to avoid conflict and kind of have it be really rigid and restrictive?
Yeah, right.
Or is conflict going to be really chaotic? It's going to be all out. If I've had friends whose family systems, like, it comes to blows, like literally.
Yeah.
Comes to blows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then 5 minutes later, they're fine, and you're sitting there as a guest, you're like,
can I move?
What is happening right now?
Yelling at each other, telling each other to shut up, you're an idiot, and
they love
screaming.
each other, right? Like they're thick as thieves, and they're so close as a family system, and it's like, this is not my system, right? Like if that kind of language is being used and that much intense emotion is showing up, I'm like I grew up over here, right? Like I grew up in this really like shut it down, lock it down. So conflict, emotions, kind of even how we show emotions or express emotions or respond to emotions can kind of fall on that same continuum of really restrictive or rigid, or somewhat chaotic and seemingly out of control. Yeah.
So alcoholism, which is a street word for the alcohol use disorder, you are beginning everything with a person's family system. So this isn't just about alcohol. It's about something that has a foundation or a bedrock. Then you move from, the idea of family systems, which while we're on family systems, let's integrate another module into that, because when a family is beginning to come to faith in Christ, then they add into it the church systems, which is a whole network of family systems that make up the same kind of idea around cultures and rules and norms and all that kind of stuff. Then you said in your opening statement about it that it is in the DSM-5, alcohol use disorder, which is a mental disorder manual. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying then is that excessive use of alcohol is considered by the professionals, the experts, as a mental disorder. Is that an accurate way to say that?
Yeah, I mean, we think about like it being rooted in the DSM-5. Yes, that's how we're thinking about it. It's of a problematic nature. Do we want to call it a mental illness in the same way as schizophrenia? Gotcha. Qualitatively, it's different.
Yeah.
And yet it falls under that umbrella of here's a distorted level of operating. Here's a pattern of behaviors that is outside of the norm or outside of typical functioning to the point that it needs clinical intervention.
Yeah, because it's really analyzing the drivers. Right. What is it that's driving it? Because it's really not about the use of alcohol. It's really about what is happening on the inside that a person would use alcohol in an excessive way. Well, let's back up and now then for everyone to know, I know you. I feel very close and have a bigger understanding of your backstory in terms of faith in Christ, in your biases, in your theological positions, your doctrines, and so on. But if you would, just kind of share with us what your doctrinal position is. I mean, I don't need to dig down into all the scripture, but just for you to be able to have an honest transparency that, I bring a bias, you bring a bias. Sure. Where do you land when it comes to this particular topic of alcohol use?
Yeah. I want to nest, I guess, my response to that, kind of my theological position in my family system experience, as well as kind of my tribe denominationally, and kind of some of the assumptions that originate there, and how there's probably more space in my theological framework for it than I practice.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the kind of the foundation, the soil that's grown out of is really important for us to wrestle with. So my grandfather on my father's side was the first man in 7 generations in his family to not pick up the bottle.
That is amazing.
We have this, and we could get into epigenetics and like what's the genetic component with alcoholism. It's actually pretty high. So 7 generations, and my grandfather is the first man to not pick up the bottle. And yet, right, like in that space, and he had other trauma. My great-great-grandfather abandoned our family in Ohio and went out to work in California and on the West Coast and was killed in an automobile accident. So my grandfather, right, like has all this modeling of alcoholism in his family system and then has trauma. So he's really ripe to just kind of say, forget it, pick up the bottle and perpetuate such an unhealthy norm of alcoholism. But he doesn't, and yet, right, the family stories that he shared, right, that my uncles and my father have shared about him, even though he didn't pick up the bottle, right, like he was the stopgap generation in our family story.
Really?
Defined by a lot of the same characteristics, right? Rageaholic when he was younger, probably if the stories that my uncles and my dad share are true, right? That in this space, and how much of that is trauma versus how much of that is epigenetic versus how much of that is, right, kind of time and culture based, maybe impossible to tell. But for him, right, when I think of something like adult children of alcoholics and other dysfunction, right, this group that helps children of alcoholics understand what it's been like to grow up in a system that's defined by dysfunction and alcoholism, right? Like I see so many of the same characteristics of my grandfather that I see listed in those, it's called the laundry list. So there's 14 dimensions: perfectionism and people pleasing and a number of other things. It's a fantastic resource. It's actually a resource that very few people in the church tend to know about, and so many people in the church tend to need.
Wow.
So, adult children of alcoholics and other dysfunction. It's the big yellow workbook. It's actually a workbook that I use with the addicts that I work with, kind of getting beneath their acting out or drug use or whatever it's been, really focusing on like, what is the soil? Like, how do we heal the wounds that drive, back to the drivers, that have driven your need to use your addiction of choice? So with that, right, like the reaction for my grandfather was to never pick up the bottle, right? Like he shifted the family culture, he shifted the norms.
It's amazing.
And yet there was some psychological residual impact that was there.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Probably I mentioned kind of the rigidity in my family, right? Like probably to the point of rigidity.
Yeah.
Right? So on that side of the family, never alcohol in the house, never alcohol permitted, never, right? And some of that is, his salvation story is being taken to a church in Nazarene on a bus ministry when he was young, teenager, right? Like, and got saved. And, the Church of the Nazarenes, there's a kind of a family system look into the past. But also the Church of the Nazarenes started in part in the slums of Los Angeles ministering to alcoholics.
Wow.
Right? So there's this kind of convergence point theologically in the history of the Church of the Nazarene and my grandfather's story. And in that intersectionality, there's a fit in his salvation story. And then he carries, right, like that norm from the church.
Yes.
Trying to find healing from so much of the pain that was caused by this litany and history of alcoholism in his own family.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the system I was raised in on my father's side, which was, right, like, again, probably rigid in its understanding, teetotalers, right?
Yeah.
My mom's story, like back to blending family systems, right? My mom's extended family system, also alcoholics in the family system, right?
Yeah.
But defined much more by kind of this chaotic makeup, right? Drinking, drunkenness at family get-togethers, right? Like mixed drinks. I think I had my first taste of black velvet, like maybe at 12 or 13, right? Thankfully, like single trial learning as a psychological phenomenon works. It was disgusting, and I didn't drink again for a number of years. But back to this blending, right? Like that my parents had to do this hard work of like teetotaling for my dad, and then my mom kind of acquiescing to that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's true or not, but like my interpretation of my family story is there was disagreements about that, but like the intensity of rigidity around the teetotaling posture kind of like subsumed my mom.
Yeah.
Because later in her life, right, like she's probably gravitated to a theological position more similar to where I land, which is really about moderation. The problem is not necessarily with alcohol.
Yeah.
The problem is the functionality that we're enculturated with, especially not even in the West, right? Because if we look at drinking patterns in Germany, drinking patterns in France, like we don't see the same type of abuse of alcohol that we see in the United States in particular.
Yeah.
Australia to some degree. But we really have, before the opiate pandemic, before the corona pandemic, before the porn pandemic, like we've had an alcohol pandemic for a long time.
Yeah.
That's gone unaddressed. Back to the DSM. In fact, when they were developing the DSM-5 through the kind of, early 2000s, 2000 to 2009, 10, 11, the research that they found was about 40% of drinkers in the United States qualify for an alcohol use disorder. But instead of, right, with those criteria that they were planning, they got that research back and thought, oh my, this bankrupts. Effectively, if we sent everybody to treatment that needs treatment, this would bankrupt the insurance industry. Wow. So they have to pivot, right? In pivoting, what do? They de-escalate the criteria that are required, which means there's a slew of folks who are struggling with problematic levels of drinking, Patrick, that won't be labeled as having a mild substance use disorder, a mild alcohol use disorder, even though our best science, when we built the criteria, right, said like this number of criteria constitutes a pattern of behavior. And they're like, that's everybody. That's 40% of people who consume alcohol.
Hey, I want to jump in here and interrupt the conversation just for a minute and tell you about a couple of opportunities for senior pastors and their spouses, as well as senior ministry leaders and their spouses. We have what we call our Zoom monthlies. This is an opportunity where Dr. Todd Bowman, neuroscientist, psychologist, behavioral expert, and myself, along with one of our guest minister leaders, this month, January the 11th, will be Reverend Tony Cook. He is a brilliant mind and author and has been the dean of a Bible college. He's been embedded into pastoral uniquenesses and nuances for years and years. It's going to be a great time. We usually have somewhere around 25 to 35 people on a Zoom. It's all free. You don't have to pay for anything. It's our gift to you. You can bring whatever topic or conversation that you want to talk about. It could have to do with strategies, tactics, what to do in a new normal of leading a church in days of COVID-19. Or you can talk about marriage and parenting, anything that has to do with the emotional drivers all the way to the specific mechanics of strategy and tactics. It's going to be an absolutely great time. Again, this is Monday night, January the 11th at 6 p.m. Central Time. All you have to do is go to Red Ink Revival, Red Ink, I-N-K, revival.com/register-now. Register-now, and you can find out everything you want to know, as well as being able to register. You do have to register, but it's free. I also want to tell you about our weeklies. We have a coaching process where we gather between 6 and 10 senior pastors and or their spouses. We bring them together, and on Thursdays for an hour in a 6-week program, we walk through the deeper issues and help you discover really what the psychological and neurobiological drivers are that go all the way back to your family of origin. And it's an amazing time. Our graduates have shown a lot of energy about the impact it's had on their lives, and they report that it's one of the most important things that they've ever done. I want to encourage you to sign up. Again, you can go to Red Ink Revival, redinkrevival.com, and go to the /register-now page, and you can see everything you want to know about it. I'm excited for a brand new module. We'll launch on January the 14th. And go for 6 weeks. I'd love for you to be a part of that. I normally have a rate of $150 an hour to be able to coach people's lives. This is a 6-week program. It would be valued at $900 for the 6 weeks. Guess what? It's my gift to you. I care about pastors. I care about people who care about everybody else, but for some reason don't know how to care for themselves. So I would love to walk you through a journey that I believe will restore your soul and will give you a whole heart. Again, it's important that you register. Go to redinkrevival.com/register-now, and you can find out all the details. Well, I want to get back to the doctrine thing, but before I do, you mentioned that, like Europe, doesn't have the same level of abuse that we do here. Why do you think it is? I mean, they drink like kids start drinking when they're young.
Yeah.
They have some kind of a half beer in Germany, half beer, half soda water that they start giving kids when they're 12, 13 years old as a dinner drink. So why do they not abuse it? What would you say is really the root factor of why here in the U.S., we just get a little crazy?
Yeah. Well, I think part of that's enculturation, right? That so much of that starting young, right? When we start young here, we're sneaking it, don't know what it's doing to us. Some of that enculturation happens at college, like just university culture in America is different than university culture. So when people onboard a lot of those drinking behaviors, like in college, right? Like it's done at parties, it's done in excess. There's just not the same kind of cultural norms that are held around alcohol here in the States as there is in Western Europe. Some of that, I think, is about stress management. When you think of the number of days off, there's about twice as many days off per year for workers in Europe as there are here. What does that do to someone's level of stress?
Yeah.
Wages tend to be a little bit higher in Europe for the same jobs that people are working here in the States. So there's a financial dynamic, there's a work to life ratio dynamic that I think loads on our need to soothe with external mechanisms. And alcohol becoming one of the most available and to that point of how we're medicating our stress, right? Alcohol sales are up 600%, Patrick, during the last 9 months of coronavirus.
Oh, wow.
People are soothing, right? Like we have been conditioned to reach outside of what we know. And even good Christian folks, right?
Right.
Who I think back to this idea theologically of what's the function of alcohol. Right? It's one thing to have wine with communion, right? Like, I think there's plenty of space for that theologically.
Right.
Do I practice that?
Right.
Unless I'm at the National Cathedral, no, I don't. Right? Do I have a problem with that theologically?
Right.
No, I don't.
Right.
Right. I think Scripture is pretty clear about the idea of moderation, about not falling into drunkenness. And I think what's interesting is we struggle with that. Like we sometimes deceive ourselves, and alcoholism is absolutely a disease of deception and denial.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We deceive ourselves into thinking that it's not a problem when it's quietly encroaching on, so it's escalation.
Yeah.
It quietly encroaches on, well, I'm only going to have 2, I'm only going to have 4, right? Why? Well, our bodies are kind of complicit in that, right? Dopaminergically, we're talking about habituation, which drives escalation, which means we need more and more and more.
Yeah. And there is no objective line. There is, I mean, when
your body and my body, my brain might have THIQ as a descendant of, on both sides, alcoholics, right? Which means my neurophysiology is going to, my physiology in general, is going to process alcohol completely differently than yours.
Yeah. So when somebody's sitting down, a good Christian person is sitting down to have drinks, and they have a line, because there's basically, 3 categories of folks who theologically and doctrinally approach alcohol. One side is that just complete abstinence, that any touch of alcohol to your lips is sin.
Right.
Then you have those who would say that, well, anything in moderation can be done, and that it's okay to drink, and nothing wrong with alcohol at communion, nothing wrong with alcohol, maybe a glass of wine at a romantic dinner. And then you have those who kind of move over into this last category, which is more the hard liquor, all the way to, drunkenness. Out of everything that's really an issue in the world, do you really think God cares about drunkenness? And it's, how's that any different than, and then they will give other kind of parallels. So when you have these, categories that people kind of fall into, and incidentally for me, I grew up essentially believing that it was sin for there to be any alcohol. That was my theological culture. But then my spiritual fathers would say, they had alcohol in their backstory from generations, and it was so abusive and so harsh, they would say it's not a sin to drink, but if you are found out to drink any alcohol anywhere, Europe, anywhere you go, your papers will be pulled. And then, today things have shifted so much where people, I've been at a Bible study with high-level leaders in business. They were the ones that organized the Bible study. They invited me to come and just hang out. I come and hang out, and everybody's drinking beer. And one of the guys that is leading it is having not 1, not 2, not 3. And of course, I'm thinking to myself, he's got a multi-million-dollar company with investors that he has entrepreneured, and his investors are probably not investing thinking that he could risk it all with something around an extremely subjective line as to what is drunk and what is not. He is making that decision for himself, and I'm sitting there, and I actually have my son with me, and we're just watching one go down after another. And we had this conversation on the way out of, whether it's an issue of sin or not, it does come back to being an issue of wisdom. What would be wise? And you have to look at the cost benefit. What is the benefit of the alcohol versus the cost? Now, I can say for me, because I want to make sure that our audiences they'll know my biases. I don't believe it's a sin, biblically, to drink alcohol. But I don't drink. Tina and I, my wife, we don't drink. There are times that I thought, man, it would be cool to have a glass of wine with a dinner, but it just, to me, wine doesn't taste any good. And so that's where I fit. I know a lot of people will say things like, especially as they get older, that they, get a drink of beer before they go to bed, or wine helps them relax and decompress, and so many kinds of things like that. I'm just one who I even have an emotional reaction to alcohol around me. Somebody drinking a glass of wine, that's not the same as somebody who has mixed hard liquor and they're drinking in front of me. As someone who is presenting as a sold-out Christian, I'm not judging them. I'm just saying my backstory causes me to have a protest. There's an internal protest to it. And so that, again, is kind of where I land. I don't think it's sin. But when I look at how many people that are incarcerated, how many of them had some kind of chemical presence whenever they made whatever the poor choices that they made in their lives. And I know for me, I think, why? What would be, I better have a high benefit if it could cost me an accident, if it could cost me a DUI, if it could cost me modeling in front of somebody else. And I'm not one, just by virtue of this conversation, I'm not one who adheres to this stereotypical, and this I'm kind of an anomaly for a lot of Christian leaders around the idea of conscience, that if I do something that weakens somebody else's conscience, that in fact I'm complicit. And I don't buy into that, in the sense that if I live under that stress point, the way that people interpret that, then I'm now controlled by everybody else. I could say everything you're doing is now then messing with my conscience, and I've got you locked out of yourself into whatever I want to control. So I don't fully buy into that whole idea. Now then, getting back to the whole drinking situation, and again, we're just being very transparent with each other that we do have some biases, we do have background, but today, Red Ink Revival, one of our heartbeats that is the core of why we exist, is to help pastors process life. And there is such a blurring of lines around alcohol these days, to the degree that there are pastors who have had a backstory similar to what we talked about, and then they learned to drink alcohol in pastoral groups. So they would go hang out with pastors who were drinking, who then they opened themselves and they began to drink. I think of one guy, he had a real issue with obesity when he was younger. He had already an addictive neurobiological profile, and when he gets into ministry, he's got a great gift, and he begins to drink with other pastors. Well, over time, he becomes an alcoholic. He has a lot of abuse, and the next thing he knows, he loses his marriage, he loses his church, and he thinks he's lost everything. And again, I think about scenarios like that, and I'm like, the cost of that, he beat the system. He beat the system for years, and then it's over. And so the question would be, what's the value of all of that? So when you think about these compromising positions, you have a lot of interactions with pastors and priests and so on. Talk a little bit about your professional client experiences with such stories where it seems like that they're actually winning against the odds If we're in Vegas, they're winning. They have high cash flow, but then all of a sudden they lose it all. Talk to us a little bit about, the idea of wisdom and the impact of alcohol in the bigger, broader view of our lives.
Yeah. I got a couple thoughts here. One would be when in the course of pastoral ministry, the pursuit of relevance trumps the pursuit of holiness, we are on the trajectory toward destruction.
If you would back that up and then bold it, highlight it, say it again.
Yeah, if in the course of pastoral ministry, our pursuit of relevance culturally trumps our pursuit of holiness spiritually, then we're on the path, the trajectory toward personal destruction.
And I think you and I both know that is a loaded statement. That isn't just something that you in passing said. And the audience, any pastor out there knows that there is this competition, this tension between relevance and then what is it that's keeping me in a process of sanctification? So back to you.
As I break it down, kind of thinking of stories of the men and women, the family systems, pastoral family systems that I've worked with, Patrick, the progression is I'm in a high stress, high need to perform environment. I need something to take the edge off, so I start to drink. Right? Alcohol use disorder, alcoholism as a kind of systemic issue, is really a disease of secrets. And most of the time, that is not happening, right? Like the alcohol consumption before I preach, the alcohol consumption before I, go on hospital calls, whatever the story that I've been told is, right? Oftentimes at some point, what starts maybe in pastoral groups or at Bible studies, right? It deviates, and there's a secretive use to it, right? Yeah. People don't know about it. We know scripturally, what happens when we keep things in the dark. They tend to fester, they tend to grow, they tend to entrench themselves. So that high stress, right? I don't know who to go to. I'm isolated as a pastor. Monday mornings are the hardest, most tempting, most challenging space in my life.
Yeah.
Because it's quiet and the church is empty and I'm exhausted emotionally and spiritually and, right? Whatever the vice might be, Monday mornings, pastors always tell me, Monday mornings are the most tempting space.
The shame voice is loud. Every mistake that you and every team member on Sunday happened, yes.
Yeah, that most, if we're honest, right, most people in the congregation didn't even pick up on unless it was really obvious or egregious error.
Right.
Right, but there is this level of, especially when I'm thinking about folks in churches, or they've beat the odds. You're not pastoring a church of 100. Not that alcoholism can't show up there, but the demands, the social demands. And at some point, put a flag in this because we need to talk about the church as an addicted family system.
Yeah. That's as the bedrock. So what you were talking about at the beginning, family system bedrock of addiction.
But now the church in distress operates a lot like an addicted family system.
It's amazing.
So this kind of sequence is high stress, high pressure, high visibility, need to perform. How do I take the edge off that? How do I still myself? Alcohol is a depressant, right? Slows down neurological functioning, messes with our memory, right? How do I slow down from this? And then it gets secret, it gets quiet.
Yeah.
And then it gets really destructive.
Yeah.
And then typically what's going to happen is a lot of the guys I work with, alcohol is not what got them into trouble. Alcohol disinhibited them, right? We talk about alcohol as a social lubricant, right? It disinhibits us, right? I can go talk to a girl at the bar because I had a drink. Right? How many cinematic moments, do you see the protagonist, take a shot and then go, right? Get the girl or go do whatever. Yeah. It's because it's a social lubricant. It's a disinhibitor. Yeah. And most guys that get into trouble and gals that get into trouble, their alcohol use wasn't the thing that got rid, because it's secretive.
Yeah.
And in their mind, it's relatively controlled. It's the disinhibiting factor, and they blur lines in relationship. They blur lines on technology. And then all of a sudden, they've created secondary issues with inappropriate relationships or gambling issues with church finances. I can tell you story after story after story. Right? But the alcohol is the catalyst for that, and the stress and the mismanagement of that, the not having eyes on them, not having accountability, not inviting people into their lives with whom they can be honest about the pressure and the stress and the temptation with alcohol. It's this pretty predictable sequence.
Yeah.
that I see more and more pastors on than I ever have.
Yeah. And so this kind of goes back to the idea of guardrails on a road, where a guardrail sits off the main road. It is often including a buffer of a shoulder from the road. So, you're driving down the road, then you hit the all the rivets in the road.
I was gonna say, like, you have the rumble
up.
strip, right? You have like the rumble strip and then the shoulder and then the guardrail.
Then the guardrail.
Right? Like, and I love that analogy from Andy Stanley, but I'm like, let's talk about the rumble strip.
Yes.
And not just the guardrail.
Yes.
Right? Because there's mechanisms in that, to your point, that are intended to alert you to where you're at.
Yes.
It shouldn't take hitting the guardrail to be like,
Yeah.
It shouldn't take into the soft shoulder, and then how many times people wreck because they overcorrect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's the function of the rumble strip. And where in the church is the rumble strip?
Yes.
Like, I think we've paved that over in our pursuit of relevance.
Oh, right.
We need to be just like the world. When we're talking 100 years ago in the church, it was about being called apart and set apart. And for millennia, God's people have been called apart and set apart. Like, the notion of holiness is about like being called apart.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet our pursuit now in our theological imaginations tend to drift toward, how do I remain culturally relevant?
Yeah, right.
And in that, to double back to the flag I planted, that's where I see the church really starting to operate like an addicted family system in our pursuit of relevance.
Yeah.
Right? Because if we think about an addicted family system, right, the core of that is the addiction, the black hole, and it just sucks everything in.
Yeah.
So some of these roles, so you asked about earlier about addicted family system, or about addiction, and I said it's a family system issue. Well, in that space, the black hole of addiction pulls people into roles to support and surround it.
Yeah.
Right? Typically, you'll have an enabler. So like you have an addict, and then you'll have an enabler, right? Someone that just gives them a free pass over and over and over again, knows the secret, but doesn't challenge it.
Yeah.
So if it's an addict, alcoholic husband, the wife knows, she keeps buying the liquor.
Yeah.
Right? She knows that, right, the money's being spent on that. She knows that, right, like there was a fifth of whiskey last week and now it's already gone.
Yeah.
Right? But like in the lack of protest, in the silence, there's an enabling.
Yeah.
Right? There's martyrs, right? Like those who literally take on the punishment. It's kind of, in many ways, it's kind of enabler, right? Like they take the punishment. They fall on their swords to protect the addict. You'll have the hero, right? This is kind of the facade, right? Like, well, if Jimmy is really good at basketball, like a basketball player as good as Jimmy couldn't come from an addicted family system. So like, even though, right, like I've smelled whiskey on Bill's breath, like Jimmy's too good of a kid, right? He's a straight A student, right? And you have this kind of social facade. And in that way, like we get pulled in as folks who know Bill and know Jimmy. If we see him as the hero, right, like we become secondary enablers.
Yeah.
Because we know something's off, but we don't ask and we don't challenge.
Yeah.
Which means, to kind of stop my narrative short here and to bring it into the church. Like that, we used to call that discipleship. Something doesn't seem right. Like, how can I step into your story?
Yeah.
Especially from a pastoral perspective.
Yeah.
But how do you pastor when you've got secrets?
Yeah.
How do you pastor when in your conscience you know that you've cultivated this secondary life in an effort to deal with the stresses of ministry?
Yeah.
And how often, if you're the pastor, and that's true, like, are you the black hole that's bringing in martyrs and bringing in enablers, right? Do you find really passive people to serve on your board that you know aren't going to challenge your authority?
Yeah.
And in that way, do you protect your secret?
Yeah.
And in that way, like, are you more inclined to pursue things of relevance culturally than to pursue a depth of authenticity and transformation because of your own secret?
Yeah. And you keep asking these questions. These are questions. And I do think one of the reasons that people in ministry in particular pursue relevance over or trumping sometimes holiness is because of the threat of legalism. That I feel that what I grew up around was all about the rules and not relationship. And so in an attempt to avoid legalism, I now empower all this freedom in my life. And the next thing you know, you are operating in areas that are going to take you down a street that Proverbs says wisdom's yelling at you about. Don't go down that street. And you're like, well, no, I'm free. I'm relevant.
Yeah, it's Galatians 5:1. right? And two.
Yes.
Right? Like that the overcorrect is like, and thousands of years ago here, Paul is writing to us, knowing that, right? Like this is a human condition issue. This isn't a 21st century United States issue. Like we all have a propensity, and I think of my grandfather even, right? Like that his overcorrection was to the seemingly like the good, the upright, the holy. Right? But if that came with an air of legalism or condescension, or it just loads the pendulum to swing that much further back.
Yes.
And I think about them, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the moral majority. Like, and are we in a space where like we've just now reached the full zenith on the other side of the pendulum?
Yeah. Right.
And how do we find this balance? How do we find this moderation? That certainly, John Wesley is a prominent voice in shaping my theology and kind of the Church of the Nazarene theology. Talks about the via media, talks about this difficult tension, this difficult balance that I think really the foundation philosophically of Scripture in Hebraic terminology would be this what Hegel would call dialectic, this tension. That's the space we're called to.
Yeah.
And yet, but the space we abandon so quickly in our pursuit of relevance.
Yeah, and I think that the real true north here is to ask ourselves better and more ongoing questions. Exploration, exploring ourselves. Why do I want to avoid legalism? Not from an academic scholarship kind of way, but in an emotional way. What is my emotional reasonings? What are the narratives that are driving me away from legalism? What is it that's threatening? What am I afraid of? And then all the way to, why do I want things like alcohol? Why is it that this is such an appeal to me? I think sanctification is not about the rules. I think sanctification is about a healthy relationship with you and God, you and you, and then you and others. So all the family systems, all the relationships you have in your life. It starts, though, with a great commandment: love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So a healthy relationship with self, which you can't be healthy with yourself if you're locked down, repressed, suppressed. Everything that has ever happened to you, you just put in a box and hope that it never comes out. But it's just like that wind-up clown that pop goes the weasel. The thing just jumps right out. So I do want to go back to this guardrail idea, though, because in the guardrail, whether you start it at that feeling it on the shoulder, all the way to the guardrail, that's intended so that you won't go over the side of the hill, right? That's classic Andy Stanley guardrails. Yet, when we look at this, so many times when I'm hearing about pastors, so, in the last few years, I know of multiple pastors who have lost everything. I know one pastor who had one of the biggest influences upon church culture that Christian history has ever had. And whenever they would have staff outings and staff meetings, there would be alcohol. And I remember him talking about this, that he would drink alcohol at these things and the team would drink alcohol at these things. And it was interesting for me. And I just kind of was just mystified, not in a negative way, but just in an interest. What's going on? But I'd feel the protest of my backstory and I'd think, what? And it seemed like that this was just a normal, healthy part of the way they interacted. Right up until, right before he's wanting to retire, he gets accused of, while he's drinking, of coming on to one of the ladies. And today, I don't know what happened. Nobody but he himself and the persons that he would have offended if he did those things, they're the only ones that know about it. The bottom line is, though, it cost him everything. More recently, there was a pastor for which I had some inroads to knowing stories around, who had a lot of influence, celebrities and so on were connected to his ministry. And regularly, I'm talking at 2 o'clock in the morning, would call his right-hand person, who was the one who had shared this with me, that his right-hand person would be called and said, hey, I'm going to go hang out at the club at 2 a.m. in the morning in a major city, and that he would drive him there, drop him off, And because he was so effective, his gifting was so outrageously penetrating, he was able to win people to Christ in those environments. But I'm sitting there thinking, your wife is nowhere around. You don't have a wingman holding your feet to the ground. Your personality is bigger than anything anybody can deal with, so nobody's going to be able to challenge you. Right. Nobody's going to be able to shut you down. Your right-hand guy who took you there is somebody who's a subordinate, and they are not, in the way the culture of the church and leadership is, they are not going to say anything. And in fact, they're so impressed with the beauty and the wonder of God's grace that is on your life that they actually are going to now model after what it is that you are doing. And so this guy, he is just very impressive, had so many great things happening in his life and ministry, and all of a sudden, it comes out that, he's had an affair, and maybe multiple affairs. Alcohol was involved in the one that came public. And so I'm having a conversation with my adult sons. And we're on a Zoom call, and I say to them, and this is something that I just think is so worthy of conversation. I say to my boys, I say, hey guys, I want to have a heart-to-heart with you. I said, let's shift away from all our fun right now, and I want to talk. This is Dad, so tolerate me. And I said, here's the deal. We've all been impressed with this person. We love him, still do. This isn't a judgment. I'm not, pounding. I'm just making a comment as a dad to two adult sons. And I said, when you guys were watching and we heard backstories of things that didn't make sense, and I would tell them back then, I'd be like, guys, that is unsustainable. That cannot be sustained. And kind of the way they would look at me is like, Dad, I trust you, but look at what he's doing, and then look where you're at, Dad. I mean, you have these comparisons.
Look at how relevant this man is.
How relevant. Yes, back to that relevant deal. And so I told him, I said, here's the deal, guys. I wonder what you guys would feel in terms of contrasting stories now, that this guy beat the system year after year after year. And so here's a question for two sons of mine. How would you want it if I had won, and I started naming celebrities, and I said, if I had won them to the Lord, and I had these kinds of crowds, and this kind of popularity, and this kind of fame, and these are the TV interviews that I'm doing, these are the people that care about who I am, and I have that for years, and then one day,
it's all gone.
It's all gone, and you find out that I've betrayed your mother. I betrayed her, and I've lost her trust, I've lost your trust, and everything is changed. Would all those years of drinking alcohol, and I'm not pitting it all on alcohol, sure. That was one piece of many systems that I began to believe were pointing him in a direction that you can't avoid, because those systems will drive you there. And so I said, but just the alcohol piece. What if I beat the system all those years, but now I've lost everything? How would that make you feel? And of course, both of them, that you could just feel the sobriety of that moment. Oh, wow. Wisdom is yelling at us. Whether it's legalism or not, the question of sanctification, our process is why? Why do you need it? Why do you want it? What is the cost that's going to happen if, in fact, these things go off rails?
Let me jump in here one more time, and I want to talk to you about Red Ink Revival's website. If you go to redinkrevival.com, you'll find out about our blog post, our podcast. We have other resources that we make available, and all the events that you would want to attend are right there, redinkrevival.com. Our Zoom monthlies, our Zoom modules for coaching that are on the weekly, all of that is available to you at redinkrevival.com. Also, I want to ask you to subscribe to our podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, subscribe. And then, if you would, do us a big favor. Go review it. Let us know what you're experiencing as you're watching or listening. And then go to YouTube. This is a big help also. Go to YouTube, to our YouTube channel, and subscribe to it. And make comments. Let people know what the impact is that it's having on your life. I'm excited about 2021. We know that whatever you invest in today is going to grow your leadership for tomorrow. Seeds turn into a harvest. 2021 is a year of supernatural increase, and I'm believing God with you for that to happen in your life. So go check it out, RedInkRevival.com, and we look forward to seeing you real soon. So again, as we begin to process through the whole idea of choices, because when somebody's in the throes of alcohol and the use of alcohol, it is a very subjective line as to how much that I can drink and not drink and it be okay. And so if you have a person who is using alcohol abusively, they often will come up with an excuse and they'll say, oh no, that was just a poor choice. So then they say that's just a poor choice. So as a professional, as an expert, how do you pull them into the honesty of, you know what, that wasn't just a poor choice. That was a poor choice that actually has a much bigger energy release. It's an addictive thing. How do you help them see that honesty?
Yeah, I think so much of dealing with any type of addictive behavior is about breaking through denial. And I think back to these penetrating questions, it's about really helping cultivate a space of honest self-reflection. How many times have you made that same poor choice?
Yeah.
Now you're telling me it's a one-off. How many times have you made that same poor choice?
Yeah.
Right? Who else do we need to talk to that's been with you when you've made these poor choices? Right? And really challenging this idea of secrecy, and addiction is a disease of deception.
That's such a strong statement.
And I think many times, like, we use biblical language, like, and so deceive ourselves. Right? How often do we deceive ourselves? This was only a problem because it went too far. It was that seventh drink. That was the problem.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure that the outcome, right? Like how many, good grief, like I think of DUI stats right now, right? Like on average, people are driving 20 to 30 times drunk before there's any, and some stats would say far more than that before there's any type of legal consequence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like the problem isn't defined by getting caught. The problem isn't evidenced in the fact that like there was objective consequences.
Yeah.
To your point, like it's about what's driving this in my heart.
Yeah.
And why do I keep coming back to something that I know contains such high potential for destruction, right?
Yeah.
Like because we deceive ourselves.
Right. Right. Interesting. What is you talked about family systems, but throughout it, we've talked about things like in Western Europe, the stress level that often is experienced on a day-to-day level may not be the same as somebody who works the hours that are here, and the university culture there is not what it is here, and so on. In other words, you're highlighting things like stress management, anxiety management,
emotional regulation, probably defined, yeah.
So dig into some of those things that are actually at the root system. I remember talking with a particular person who is in all definitions is definable as someone with an alcohol use disorder. And as we're talking, he says to me, I'm not interested in going back into my backstory. I'm not interested in my family. I'm not interested. I want to know how to handle this today. And he said, I didn't want to live through some of the things that I lived through. And it's interesting because he was hyper guarding his family. Again, that whole family secret thing, hyper guarding it. It's like, I want to make sure that my family has this golden glossy kind of feel about it, and I don't want to damage that by going back there. And I think about what I'm asking you. Go ahead.
No, that just speaks to the pressure that exists in addicted family systems, where what is caught, what is implied, what is intuited, maybe not even ever expressed overtly, is the need to protect the secret, the need to protect the individual struggling with addiction.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, when I hear stories of pastors who clearly are drowning in their troubles, right? Like they're overwhelmed with stress and they're using some type, I don't care if it's pornography addiction, gambling addiction, drugs or alcohol addiction. They're clearly struggling. The unhealthy, dysfunctional churches will begin to protect that dysfunction because of the strength of personality, because of the charisma, because of the brilliance as a preacher or teacher, or right? But there's this implicit fear in our church systems where we protect pastors who are really struggling instead of helping them orient to the truth and get the help they need. That shows up with kids in addictive family systems. They're bonded to the caretaking and protecting of the alcoholic. Same thing. I don't care if we're talking about alcoholism in the pastorate or pornography addiction or any type of addictive behavior. It's the same systemic dynamic.
Well,
And what we have to do is, to your point, right? Like delve into the backstory. What's honestly going on here? You know, Jay Stringer in his book Unwanted talks about honesty at the expense of honor, right? Like that we pursue honor at the expense of honesty. That we pursue honor, right? Like protect the family system, protect the image of the church, at the expense of honesty, the expense of integrity.
Absolutely. Well, let's just take a few minutes here and talk through. So, stress management. What is that? What is stress management? And why would alcohol be something that, I'd go towards?
Immediacy. Like we're a culture that is rooted in immediate gratification. And rather than taking the walk, doing the journaling, doing the prayer time, doing like things that we know help manage our affect, conversating with someone, time in prayer, conversating with the Lord, right? Like we can go right to the instant chemical shift. Which, I don't know, like I think that, there's fascinating neurobiology into that, right? I think that dietary-wise, like another issue with Europe is that we eat so much more processed food and sugars. And that the underpinnings of addictive neurobiology are present for most of us by 5 or 6 years old because of our diet, mostly on processed foods with high sugars. Sugar being the most addictive substance to our bodies. It makes me wonder, right? If I had a I don't know, like a Fulbright scholarship or something, I would absolutely study like what is the impact of sugar consumption on later addictive neurological functioning.
Wow.
If it's true that like we're feeding our kids tons and tons and tons of refined processed sugars,
setting them up to
and then we're surprised
addictive.
That like they're addicted to video games, then later addicted to pornography, and later addicted to alcohol or other like, oh wait a minute, like let's go back. So, but to your point with this individual, I think we have to go back to what's the genesis of the story. Like we can't just focus on, because what I hear in that is the same problem. Like I want an immediate fix. Well, the issue is that you've been using a substance to get the immediate fix and that's not been working. Like what we need is a holistic foundation level repair. Not just trade out the quick fix. But we have short imaginations, right? Like, meaning we project into the future very, very short term as Westerners. Like we don't think about in a year, let alone like 3 generations from now. We're very myopic, like very short-sighted, which is fascinating because you mentioned me doing stacks and stacks or decks and decks of assessments for pastors. It's fascinating and somewhat disheartening to see one of the 3 primary elevations that I see with pastors on their psychological profiles is egocentricity, myopia. They can only see what they want in themselves. And I think that's part, maybe not exclusively, but like that's a fascinating thread of this conversation we're happening because addiction is very much about short-sightedness and about getting what I want. At the expense of other frames of reference or other perspectives.
But the reason that they only see the things that they want to see in themselves is because there's such a threat that somewhere along the line came into their peripheral vision of if I am what I think I see in me, I cannot tolerate the pain or the shame. So what I must do is absolutely blind off those things that then, again, perpetuate the myopic, even things that are stress management. Deal with stress. Let's just get down on stress some. What is the functioning of stress? If this is really one way, alcoholism does more than just deal with stress. There's lots of factors, but just for us in this moment, what is stress neurobiologically, and what are we trying to hit when we're trying to manage stress?
Stress is the rumble strip in the analogy that we've been using.
There you go.
Like, stress is just our bodies alerting us to the fact that we're exhausted, we're overwhelmed, we're under-resourced to meet the demands of whatever the situation is in front of us. Right? So it's just an alert system, right? Like, and I don't know, stress kind of gets a pejorative connotation in our culture. Like, oh, I'm just so stressed. Like, you are stressed, right? I'm stressed. We all get stressed. But like, distress is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, it's a type of God-imbued boundary for our biology that our minds are supposed to translate and say, like, something needs to change here.
Yeah.
Like, I need to redirect.
Yeah.
Instead of, I need to numb out so I can just keep driving on the rumble strip without feeling it.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is where we get into food addiction, gambling addiction, gaming addiction, pornography addiction, drug addiction, alcoholism, shopping, spending. Can I keep going?
Yeah, right.
Here's where we're at culturally is, I said, paving over the rumble strip, right? Like, those behaviors literally neurochemically numb us out, so we're driving on the rumble strip, but we're not getting the indicator in the vibration of the wheel that, like, we need to get back on. There's actually smooth road that we could just easily correct back onto.
Yeah.
Without having to wreck the car.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, so stress gets such a negative connotation when it really is a gift. But how we orient to that, right? There's this imperviousness in our culture, right? This kind of John Wayne mentality. And like, we're not going to be defined by that. We're going to kick the horse, right? Like, and just go.
Right.
And I think, like, that again is the path to destruction when we're not honoring God's design and not adhering to God's design.
Yeah. Because truly, the way we're supposed to process stress is to turn towards it with God. So things like you mentioned earlier, spending time in prayer where you're able to metabolize it. Then moving into things like journaling, things where you're in community, but the community is not being physically in the environment, it is being emotionally connected in the environment, where we're drawing from the intimate energy of those in the group, which is, fascinating. And so alcoholism just becomes a replacement, or porn or gambling or whatever. It's a replacement. There are other factors, so we talked a little bit about stress. There are a lot of others, but what I want to do is I want to make this part one of a two-part episode where we'll come back and let's talk deeper into what does a person do. I even want to get into families. I think of wives who are at their wits' end and they're finding hidden bottles and they're trying to figure out what to do. Even what do you do for a teenage boy who is watching a dad who's an alcoholic but in denial, and they don't have money. They don't have money to go to a $50,000, inpatient retreat center. So let's talk about some of those when we get back together again and keep it rolling. But today was awesome, man. Thanks.
Yeah, looking forward to it.